Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A simple flight. Elijah Carter stepped onto the aircraft, feeling the weight of the long hours he'd logged in recent days. The jet bridge seemed quieter than usual, the distant hum of engines serving as a reminder of how many miles he'd covered recently, Tokyo to Dubai to London. Today, however, the journey was different. He wasn't here to fly the plane. For once, Elijah was traveling as a passenger, not the captain. Dressed in a navy sweater and jeans, Elijah was a far cry from his usual crisp uniform with 4 gold stripes on the shoulders. Those stripes had opened countless doors for him, but without them, he was just another traveler. Yet, he felt oddly liberated. After all, it wasn't every day he got to enjoy the luxury of first class, thanks to a well-timed upgrade and his miles. He intended to savor every moment. "Just on your right, sir," the flight attendant at the door greeted him with a polite, if somewhat mechanical, smile. "Thank you," Elijah replied, stepping into the cabin. He could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere. First class always had that aura of exclusivity, the air of privilege that set it apart from the cramped confines of economy. Today, that exclusivity included him, and he was determined to make the most of it. The leather seat in 2A seemed to welcome him as he sank into it. The wide armrests, the extra legroom, the pristine blanket folded neatly on the seat, it all felt surreal. Elijah placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, already feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate. He pulled out a worn copy of The Shadow of the Wind from his carry-on, a book his wife Sarah had been insisting he read for months. It was about time he honored that request. He glanced around the cabin, taking in his fellow passengers. Across the aisle, a businessman in a tailored suit glanced his way, eyes flickering with something unspoken, before quickly looking away. The older woman in 2C, adorned with a string of pearls, stole quick glances at him as if puzzling over his presence. Elijah wasn't surprised. 20 years in the airline industry had taught him that no matter how much the world changed, some biases remained stubbornly intact. As the cabin filled with the shuffle of passengers finding their seats and stowing their belongings, Elijah leaned back, his thumb flicking through his phone. He typed out a quick message to Sarah. "On board. First class is nice. You'd love it. Mick would be spoiled." He smiled at her almost instant reply. "About time. Don't forget to enjoy the warm nuts. Worth every mile." He chuckled softly. Sarah always found joy in the small pleasures, and she was right, those warm nuts were one of the best perks of first class. The pre-flight announcements began, the soothing voice of the purser reminding everyone of safety procedures. Elijah barely listened. He knew the script by heart, having delivered it himself countless times. Instead, he watched the activity around him. Flight attendants moved efficiently, stowing last-minute bags and offering pre-departure drinks. A young couple in the row ahead whispered excitedly, their honeymoon evident in their glowing faces. A man in a sharp blue blazer tapped away on his laptop, oblivious to the world around him. It was then that she appeared. The flight attendant approached with the confidence of someone who had been in the industry for years. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair styled in a sleek bun. But her eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of hesitation as they landed on Elijah. She stopped in the aisle beside his seat, her smile fixed but tight. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone professional but edged with something sharper. "I believe there's been a mistake." Elijah frowned, looking up from his book. "A mistake?" "Yes, sir." She gestured toward his seat. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." "I'm aware," Elijah replied calmly, though he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin turning toward them. "I'm in the right seat." Her smile faltered. "Perhaps you'd like to check your boarding pass again?" Elijah didn't need to check. He'd double-checked when he first received the upgrade. But he reached into his pocket, retrieving the small paper slip. Without a word, he handed it to her. She scanned it, her eyes narrowing as if searching for a discrepancy. She murmured, handing it back. Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to let us know. Thank you, Elijah replied, keeping his tone measured. He didn't miss the glances exchanged among the other passengers, nor the way the older woman in 2C quickly turned her gaze out the window. The flight attendant moved on, but the tension lingered. Elijah returned to his book, though his focus wavered. He'd dealt with moments like these before, quiet assumptions, subtle dismissals. But he'd also learned not to let them define his day. He shifted in his seat, willing himself to relax. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure and weather conditions at their destination. Elijah allowed himself a small smile, recognizing the familiar cadence. Pilots all seemed to share that same tone of calm authority. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Elijah glanced out the window. He thought about the countless times he'd been on the other side of the cockpit door, commanding an aircraft through skies dotted with turbulence or painted with sunsets. Today, he was just a passenger, and that was enough. Or so he thought. The plane had barely begun its ascent when Elijah noticed a flurry of activity at the front of the cabin. The flight attendant who had questioned him earlier hurried down the aisle, her face pale. She stopped abruptly at his row, her voice lowered but urgent. "Mr. Carter," she said, her previous tone replaced with something bordering on desperation. "The captain has requested your presence in the cockpit. Immediately." Elijah stared at her, stunned. "What? Why?" "I don't know," she admitted, wringing her hands. "But he said it's urgent." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Elijah stood, the whispers of the other passengers a quiet hum behind him. He followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit, his mind racing. What could possibly require his expertise when he wasn't even on duty? As the cockpit door loomed ahead, Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself. Whatever awaited him beyond that door, he knew one thing for certain: this flight was about to take a very unexpected turn. Into the unknown. Elijah Carter stepped into the narrow corridor leading to the cockpit, his thoughts a whirl of confusion and unease. The flight attendant who had fetched him walked briskly ahead, occasionally glancing over her shoulder. Her earlier judgmental demeanor had been replaced by something more frantic, genuine concern. Elijah's instincts kicked in. Years in the aviation industry had taught him to read situations quickly, and this one had emergency written all over it. "Can you tell me anything more?" Elijah pressed as they neared the cockpit door. I'm not sure," the flight attendant stammered, clearly out of her depth. "The captain just said you were the only person on board qualified to help." "Qualified to help?" Elijah frowned. He was off duty, dressed in casual clothes, seated among passengers. What could possibly require his expertise? His mind sifted through possibilities: mechanical failure, medical emergencies, even potential security threats. None of them made sense. When they reached the cockpit door, the flight attendant entered the security code and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. The door opened to reveal a scene Elijah hadn't expected. The captain, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, was slumped in his chair. His co-pilot, a younger woman whose uniform bore the name tag Richards, was visibly shaken as she wrestled with the controls, sweat beading her forehead. "Elijah Carter?" Richards asked, her voice strained but filled with relief as he stepped into the cramped space. "Yes," Elijah replied. "What's going on?" "It's Captain Morgan," she said, gesturing to the unconscious man beside her. "He collapsed just after takeoff. He was complaining of chest pains during the pre-flight check, but he insisted he was fine." Elijah's gaze snapped to the captain. Morgan's breathing was shallow, his face pale and glistening with sweat. It was clear he needed medical attention, and fast. "Why wasn't this called in earlier?" Elijah asked, quickly scanning the cockpit controls. "I didn't want to declare an emergency unless I had no other choice," Richards admitted, her hand steady on the yoke, despite her evident anxiety. "I've been handling the flight on my own so far, but this is a long haul to New York, and I can't do it alone." Elijah nodded, already assessing the situation. What's your experience level? I'm certified for this aircraft, but I've only been co-piloting for 2 years. I've never flown solo in a real emergency, she confessed. You won't have to, Elijah said firmly, taking the vacant seat beside her. I've got your back. Richards exhaled in relief as Elijah adjusted the seat and scanned the instrument panel. It had been months since he'd last flown, but his muscle memory kicked in almost immediately. Flying was second nature to him, as familiar as breathing. Elijah Carter, huh? Richards said as she glanced sideways at him. I've heard of you. The youngest captain too. Earned 4 stripes in your class, right? That was a long time ago, Elijah replied, his focus on the controls. Let's focus on what's ahead of us. Fair enough, Richards agreed, a hint of respect in her voice. Elijah toggled the radio switch. This is First Officer Carter, temporarily assuming command of Flight 182 to New York. Captain Morgan is unresponsive due to a medical emergency. Requesting immediate guidance and coordination for diversion to the nearest suitable airport. The air traffic controller's voice came through, calm and professional. Understood, Flight 182. Stand by while we assess available options. As they awaited instructions, Elijah turned to Richards. Status update? Engines are steady, fuel levels are sufficient for several hours of flight. All passengers are secured. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet, she reported. Good, Elijah said. Let's keep it that way. I'll handle the comms and navigation adjustments. You focus on maintaining altitude and heading. She nodded, her grip on the yoke relaxing slightly as the weight of the situation began to lift. Elijah admired her composure. He'd seen seasoned pilots crumble under pressure, but Richards was holding her own. The radio crackled again. Flight 182, divert to Reykjavik Airport. They're clearing the runway for an emergency landing. Coordinates and descent instructions are being transmitted now. Copy that, Elijah replied, adjusting the autopilot settings. He leaned closer to Richards. You good with this? Yeah, she said, her confidence growing. Let's do it. As the plane began its descent, Elijah spared a glance at Captain Morgan. His condition seemed stable for now, but it was a grim reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Elijah's mind flickered to the passengers behind him. They had no idea what was happening up here, and for now, that was a good thing. Panic wouldn't help anyone. Richards broke the silence. You know, it's funny. When I saw you boarding in first class, I wondered what you did to earn the upgrade. Guess I should have figured you were a pilot. Elijah smirked. I usually sit in economy, but my wife insisted I cash in the miles for once. I didn't think I'd end up back here. Life's funny like that, Richards said, a small smile breaking through her tension. Elijah focused on the task at hand. Reykjavik's runway coordinates appeared on the screen, and he began plotting the approach. The Icelandic landscape came into view, its snowy peaks and rugged terrain a stark contrast to the chaos inside the cockpit. Flaps to 20, Elijah instructed as they neared the airport. Richards complied, her movements precise. The tower cleared them for landing, and Elijah took the controls for the final approach. The runway lights grew larger in the windshield, guiding them like a beacon. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the ground loomed closer. This was where all his years of training paid off, the moment where precision met instinct. Brace for landing, Elijah announced over the intercom, his voice steady. He could only hope the passengers would follow the instructions without panic. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the plane roaring as Elijah applied reverse thrust. The aircraft slowed, the tension in the cockpit releasing with every decelerating second. When the plane finally came to a stop, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause, though none of the passengers fully understood what had just transpired. Elijah glanced at Richards, who let out a breathless laugh. Well, that was something. Good work, Elijah said, a rare smile crossing his face. You held it together. The radio buzzed with the tower's voice. Flight 182, welcome to Reykjavik. Medical personnel are en route. As emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, Elijah unbuckled his harness and stood, his body finally registering the toll of the ordeal. Before he left the cockpit, Richards grabbed his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You saved us today." Elijah nodded, his expression softening. "You saved yourself. I just helped." As he stepped back into the cabin, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The passengers watched him with curious eyes, unaware of the role he had played in their safe landing. Elijah didn't mind. He didn't need the recognition. For him, the satisfaction of knowing he had done his job, even when he wasn't supposed to, was reward enough. The cost of calm. The plane had come to a full stop, and the cabin was alive with restless energy. Elijah Carter stepped back into the main cabin, the cool professionalism of the cockpit now giving way to the reality of the passenger experience. The muffled sound of clapping had died down, replaced by a hum of anxious murmurs and speculative whispers. Passengers exchanged glances, craning their necks to see what was happening, while others fumbled with their seat belts, eager to stand despite the seatbelt sign still illuminated. Elijah's sharp eyes swept the cabin. He noticed the flight attendants working quickly to maintain order, their cheerful, scripted smiles now tinged with nervousness. It was a subtle but telling shift. For passengers, landing safely was a relief, but for the crew, the knowledge of how close things had come to disaster lingered like a shadow. Elijah made his way toward his seat in first class, where his belongings remained stowed. The older woman in 2C, the one who had been casting suspicious glances earlier, caught his eye. Her expression softened now, her curiosity replaced with quiet gratitude. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly as he reached for his bag. "Were you the one who helped?" Elijah paused, unsure how to respond. Modesty dictated a casual dismissal, but he also didn't want to downplay the severity of the situation. "I assisted where I could," he said simply. "Well, thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering why the landing felt different. It was smoother than usual." Elijah smiled politely, not bothering to explain that smooth had been far from his mind during the emergency descent. "I'm glad we're all safe," he replied, moving on before the conversation could dig deeper. Just as he retrieved his carry-on, a voice came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Medical personnel are now boarding to assist Captain Morgan. We'll begin deplaning shortly once clearance is given." The announcement brought a fresh wave of chatter. Elijah glanced toward the front of the cabin, where a team of paramedics had entered. He watched as they maneuvered through the narrow aisle with a stretcher, disappearing into the cockpit. His chest tightened. Morgan had been a colleague in the industry for years, a good man and a solid pilot. Elijah hoped this wouldn't mark the end of his career. A tap on his shoulder drew Elijah's attention. It was the flight attendant who had earlier questioned his presence in first class. Her demeanor had shifted entirely. Where there had been skepticism, there was now deference. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice lower than usual. "The captain asked me to thank you. And on behalf of the crew, I want to say how grateful we are. You stepped up in a way, well, it made all the difference." Elijah nodded, his face neutral. He didn't need the praise, it wasn't why he'd done it. It was the right thing to do, he said. "How's Captain Morgan?" "They're stabilizing him now," she replied. "He's conscious but weak. The paramedics say it looks like a mild heart attack." Elijah winced. Heart issues were no small matter in aviation. Even if Morgan recovered fully, the rigorous health standards for pilots might prevent him from ever flying again. It was a stark reminder of the pressures that came with the job. "I hope he pulls through," Elijah said sincerely. The flight attendant hesitated. "The first officer, Richards, asked if you'd be willing to stay behind and debrief with the local authorities." "Just protocol, you understand." "I figured as much," Elijah said, already preparing himself mentally. Emergency landings often meant paperwork, questions, and endless rehashing of decisions. It was part of the job, and he wasn't one to shy away from it. As the paramedics wheeled Captain Morgan out of the cockpit, Elijah saw Richard step into the cabin. She looked drained but composed, her uniform slightly rumpled and her hair coming loose from its neat bun. When she spotted Elijah, she made a beeline for him. "Carter," she said, offering a tired smile. "They're asking for us both to debrief. I told them you were the one who took over." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "We both handled that landing. Don't sell yourself short." Richards gave a small laugh, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've got a long way to go before I can match what you just did." That was masterful. "Experience helps," Elijah said, shouldering his carry-on. "But you've got good instincts. Trust them." Before Richards could respond, another flight attendant approached, gesturing toward the exit. "Gentlemen from the local aviation authority are waiting in the terminal," she informed them. "They're setting up a private space for the debrief." Elijah nodded and followed Richards off the plane. As they descended the stairs onto the tarmac, the cold Icelandic air hit him like a slap. Snow flurries danced in the distance, and the gray skies made the runway's lights seem all the brighter. Emergency vehicles were parked nearby, their lights flashing but silent. It was an eerie contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Inside the terminal, they were directed to a small conference room where two men in suits and a woman in uniform waited. The debrief began immediately. Elijah and Richards recounted the events in meticulous detail: the captain's collapse, the decision to take over, the communication with air traffic control, and the emergency landing. Elijah kept his answers concise, aware that every word would be scrutinized for accuracy. The woman in uniform, an aviation safety inspector, nodded as she jotted notes. "Captain Carter," she said, addressing him formally, "your actions undoubtedly prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation. We'll need to review flight data and cockpit recordings, but your account matches the preliminary reports." "Thank you," Elijah replied, though the weight of her words settled heavily on him. He didn't feel like a hero, just a professional who had done his job. After what felt like hours, the debrief concluded. As they exited the room, Richards turned to Elijah. "I owe you one," she said. "If you hadn't been on that flight, well, I don't want to think about what might have happened." "You don't owe me anything," Elijah said. "You held your own up there. That's what matters." Richards shook her head. "I mean it. You're the kind of pilot I want to be someday." Elijah gave her a rare, genuine smile. "You're already on your way." As they walked back toward the terminal lounge, Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Sarah. "Saw the news. Are you okay? Call me as soon as you can. Mick wants to hear your voice." Elijah sighed, the events of the day finally catching up with him. He tapped out a quick reply. "Safe and sound. We'll call soon. Love you." As he hit send, he glanced out the window at the grounded plane, now bathed in twilight. It wasn't the first time he'd faced the unexpected in his career, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, the stakes had felt higher. He had been a passenger, an observer, until fate had called him to step forward. Walking toward the waiting area, Elijah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and gratitude. He didn't know what lay ahead, whether this day would fade into memory or become a defining chapter of his life. But for now, he was content to know that, when it mattered most, he had been there. The weight of leadership. The Reykjavik terminal lounge was quiet, save for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional click of footsteps on polished floors. Most of the passengers from Flight 182 had either been rebooked or were being cared for in designated waiting areas. The storm outside had picked up, swirling snow against the large glass windows that framed the runway. Elijah Carter sat in one of the lounge chairs, a cup of untouched coffee cooling on the table in front of him. His thoughts were elsewhere. Richards had left a few moments earlier, heading to the hotel arranged by the airline. Elijah, however, stayed behind, feeling the familiar pull of duty and reflection. Years of flying had taught him that every emergency, no matter how well handled, left its mark. Today had been no exception. He leaned back in the chair, staring at his phone screen, where Sarah's earlier text still glowed faintly. Saw the news. Are you okay? The words echoed in his mind, a reminder of how close things had come. He thought about calling her, but hesitated. He needed time to collect himself, to sift through the emotional aftermath of the day. Instead, he pulled out his well-worn copy of The Shadow of the Wind from his bag, flipping idly through the pages. The book had been his refuge during the flight, a brief escape before everything had unraveled. Now, it felt like a lifeline, grounding him in the familiar. A voice broke his reverie. Captain Carter? Elijah looked up to see a man in his late 40s, dressed in the standard uniform of a senior airline official. The man's face was a study in practiced neutrality, but his eyes carried the weight of responsibility. Behind him stood a younger woman, a clipboard in hand and an air of quiet efficiency about her. Yes, Elijah replied, closing the book and sitting up straighter. I'm Marcus Thorson, operations manager for the airline. This is Anna, from our safety team, the man said, extending a hand. Elijah shook it firmly. First, let me say how grateful we are for your actions today. You stepped up in a way few could. I appreciate that, Elijah said, though his tone was measured. He wasn't one for accolades, especially not when lives had been at stake. Thorson gestured toward the seat across from Elijah. May we sit? Of course, Elijah said, motioning for them to join him. Anna took a seat beside Thorson, her pen poised over the clipboard. We'd like to go over a few things, she began. Mainly to document your account for our internal records. The Aviation Authority will conduct their own investigation, but we want to ensure we capture your perspective as accurately as possible. Elijah nodded. He understood the drill. Every incident, no matter how small or large, required a paper trail. He recounted the events again, this time focusing on the technical details, the cockpit environment, the transition of control, the communication with air traffic control, and the landing itself. Anna scribbled furiously, occasionally pausing to ask for clarification. When Elijah finished, Thorson leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. It's clear you've not only saved lives today, but also demonstrated exceptional leadership. Have you considered returning to active duty as a captain? Elijah's brows furrowed. I'm not sure where that's coming from. Thorson smiled faintly. We've reviewed your record, Captain Carter. It's impeccable. Yet, for the past 2 years, you've been flying reduced hours, mostly short-haul flights. A pilot with your experience, well, it's a rarity. Elijah hesitated. The decision to scale back his hours had been a deliberate one, driven by his desire to spend more time with his family. Mick, his 10-year-old daughter, had been the biggest factor. He'd missed too many of her milestones, too many soccer games and science fairs. The long-haul flights, the endless nights away from home, they had taken their toll. I appreciate the sentiment, Elijah said carefully. But I stepped back for a reason. My family needed me. Anna glanced at Thorson, then back at Elijah. If you don't mind me asking, she said, her tone cautious, what made you decide to step up today? You could have stayed in your seat and let the co-pilot handle it. Elijah paused, considering her question. I didn't have much of a choice, he said after a moment. Captain Morgan was incapacitated, and Richards, while capable, didn't have the experience for that kind of emergency. If I hadn't stepped in, the outcome could have been very different. Thorson nodded. And that instinct, that willingness to take responsibility, that's exactly what makes you invaluable. Elijah leaned forward, his hands clasped. I'm not sure you understand. It's not about whether I can handle the pressure. I've spent my entire career doing that. But flying isn't the only thing in my life. My family deserves my time, too. Today was exceptional. But it's not something I'm eager to make a habit. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Elijah's words settling over the conversation. Thorson seemed to consider this, his expression softening. I respect that, he said finally. But I hope you know that if you ever decide to return to a full schedule, the door is always open. Elijah nodded, though he didn't respond. The idea of returning to long-haul flights, to the relentless grind of the airline industry, felt distant and almost foreign now. His life had shifted, his priorities realigned. Anna cleared her throat, breaking the silence. There's one more thing we'd like to address, she said, flipping to a new page on her clipboard. Your presence on this flight was fortuitous, to say the least. But it raises a question of protocol. Should airlines consider requiring off-duty pilots to identify themselves during check-in? Elijah raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting I should have announced I was a pilot when I boarded? Not exactly, Anna said quickly. But in emergencies like this, having that knowledge up front could potentially save time. It's an interesting idea, Elijah admitted. But it's also a slippery slope. Most off-duty pilots travel to relax, not to work. Identifying ourselves could create unnecessary expectations, or even liabilities. Thorson nodded thoughtfully. A valid point. It's something we'll need to discuss further. As the conversation wound down, Thorson and Anna stood, thanking Elijah once again, before leaving him alone in the lounge. Elijah exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, the snow whipping against the windows in frenzied patterns. His phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from Sarah, Mick holding up a hand-drawn picture of an airplane, her wide grin framed by unruly curls. The caption read, "She says this is you saving the day. Call us soon. Love you." Elijah smiled, the knot in his chest loosening. He typed out a quick reply. Tell her she's right. Love you both. Calling now. As he pressed the call button, Elijah realized something profound. Today hadn't just been about saving lives or proving his skills as a pilot. It had been a reminder of why he'd chosen to step back from the cockpit in the first place. Leadership wasn't just about stepping up in emergencies, it was about knowing when to step back, too. Grounded in purpose. The call to Sarah and Mick had done more to settle Elijah Carter's nerves than any debrief, coffee, or quiet reflection ever could. Hearing Mick's excited voice recount her drawing process and Sarah's calm, steady reassurance reminded him why he'd stepped back from the rigorous demands of his aviation career. But as the evening wore on, the events of the day continued to weigh heavily on his mind. Now seated in a small but comfortable room at the airline-provided hotel, Elijah stared out the window at the swirling snowstorm. Reykjavik was shrouded in white, its distant mountains barely visible against the overcast sky. His carry-on sat unopened by the bed, and his book rested on the nightstand, untouched since he'd closed it mid-flight. He leaned back in the chair, replaying the day's events in his mind. The flight attendant's skepticism, Captain Morgan's collapse, the co-pilot's palpable fear, and the tense moments in the cockpit all blended into a hazy recollection. Yet, one moment stood out, with sharp clarity, the landing. The split-second decisions, the calm control of the aircraft, and the immense responsibility of ensuring the safety of hundreds of people. That moment had reignited something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. But alongside that spark was a familiar pang of exhaustion. The weight of leadership wasn't new to Elijah, and he had long since learned that even when the landing gear touched the ground, the true work had just begun. The call that changes everything. Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone on the table. He picked it up, surprised to see an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for only a moment, he swiped to answer. Hello? Elijah Carter? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and carried the kind of authority Elijah immediately recognized. Whoever this was, they weren't calling casually. Yes, this is Carter, he replied cautiously. This is Donna Reeves, Director of Emergency Operations for the Federal Aviation Administration. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Elijah sat up straighter, the mention of the FAA immediately commanding his attention. Not at all. How can I help? We've been briefed on the events of Flight 182, Donna continued. I want to start by saying how impressed we are with your actions today. What you did was nothing short of extraordinary. Thank you, Elijah said, though his tone was guarded. Compliments like these often came with strings attached. Donna didn't miss a beat. I know you're off duty and haven't been flying full-time for a while, but I have a proposition for you. One that might interest someone with your expertise. Elijah frowned, intrigued but wary. I'm listening. Your ability to step into a high-pressure situation, assess the dynamics, and lead effectively isn't something we see every day, Donna said. We're building a specialized task force focused on in-flight crisis management, everything from medical emergencies and mechanical failures to potential security threats. The idea is to train a select group of pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff to handle extreme situations more efficiently. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the gears in his mind turning. And you're asking me to be part of this? I'm asking you to lead it, Donna clarified. We need someone with your unique combination of experience and temperament. Someone who's seen every angle of aviation and can teach others how to stay calm under pressure. Your actions today weren't just skillful, they were textbook. And we'd like to make those actions the standard. The room seemed to grow quieter as Elijah considered her words. The offer was unexpected, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. His family had been his priority for the past 2 years, and the thought of taking on such a demanding role felt like a step back toward the life he had deliberately left behind. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully. But my time in the cockpit has been reduced for a reason. My family. Of course, Donna interjected, her tone understanding. And we wouldn't expect you to return to full-time flying. This role is different. It's less about hours in the air and more about training and mentorship. You'd be based primarily on the ground, with occasional travel for workshops and simulations. That gave Elijah pause. The idea of staying grounded while still contributing to the industry he loved was appealing. And if he could help other pilots and crews navigate emergencies with the same composure he'd shown today, it might be worth considering. I'll need some time to think about it, he said finally. Take all the time you need, Donna replied. But I'll be honest, we're hoping to move quickly. You've already proven you're the kind of leader this program needs. After exchanging contact information, Elijah ended the call. For a long moment, he stared at the phone in his hand, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Reflections and realizations. Later that night, Elijah called Sarah. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and familiar. Hey, she said. How are you holding up? Tired, he admitted. But okay. How's Mick? She's fine. Asleep now, but she spent the whole evening telling me about how her dad saved a plane. She's already asked if she can bring her drawing to school tomorrow. Elijah chuckled softly. That sounds like her. Are you sure you're okay? Sarah pressed. You've been through a lot today. I'm fine, Elijah said, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. I had a call from the FAA. Oh? Sarah's tone shifted, curious. What about? They want me to lead a new program for in-flight crisis management, Elijah explained. It's more of a training role, mostly ground-based. But it's a lot. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was calm but firm. Elijah, you've always been at your best when you're helping others. It's who you are. If this is something you want to do, we'll make it work. Elijah felt a swell of gratitude. Sarah had always been his anchor, supporting him even when his career had pulled him away from home for long stretches. It's not just about what I want, he said. It's about us. And we'll figure it out together, Sarah replied. Just like we always do. Her words settled something within him. For years, Elijah had wrestled with the balance between his passion for flying and his commitment to his family. But maybe this opportunity wasn't about choosing one over the other. Maybe it was about finding a way to bring the two together. The new horizon. By the time Elijah boarded his connecting flight back home the next morning, he had made his decision. He would accept the FAA's offer, not because he missed the cockpit, but because he saw the chance to make a difference beyond the confines of a single aircraft. He could help shape the next generation of pilots and crew, ensuring that they were prepared for whatever challenges the skies might throw at them. As the plane taxied down the runway, Elijah glanced out the window, the Icelandic landscape fading into the distance. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just another chapter in his career, it was a new beginning. One where he could lead, teach, and still come home to the family that meant everything to him. The engines roared, the plane lifted into the air, and Elijah Carter smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly grounded, even at 30,000 feet.